Hello and welcome to History of Boxing. I'm Kevin Pumfret. Today we're going to be going over the Olympic history of boxing. Fantastic stuff. So basically, the earliest evidence of boxing dates back to around 3000 BC, older than Jesus, so pretty old if you ask me. The sport was introduced to ancient Olympic Games by the Greeks sometime in the 7th century BC. So it's been around for quite some time. So at this time in the Olympics, instead of the traditional boxing gloves that they use now, obviously they wouldn't have boxing gloves laying around back then. They used soft leather thongs that they would bind their hands and forearms with for protection. And so it went on like this for quite some time until later on Rome had made some developments to boxing, such as replacing these thongs with something called the cestus, which was a glove studded with metal. So obviously, this made the sport quite a bit more dangerous for everyone involved, with most fights at this time period ended in death. It was quite a bit more dangerous back then than it already is now. So later on, with the fall of the Roman Empire, boxing just came to a sudden end. So there wasn't really any boxing going on from the fall of the Roman Empire up until 17th century England. So it's a very, very big gap between a very big gap of just no boxing. So finally, in 17th century England, so finally, organized amateur boxing matches officially began in 1880. Originally, there were only 5 classes. These included bantamweight, featherweight, lightweight, and middleweight, and heavyweight. Boxing officially made its debut in modern Olympics in 1904. And so the 1904 Olympic Games were in St. Louis, in the U.S., where it was the only country that entered in boxing, so they got all the medals. Still today, America mostly continues to dominate Olympic boxing with 109 medals in the sport. And so I may have forgot to mention this earlier, actually, but in 1890, the modern day boxing glove was invented. So interesting fact, and made the sport a lot safer. And so that's interesting. And so basically, later on in 1992. There was an electric scoring system introduced for more objective refereeing. So, I guess they wanted less biased refereeing. They wanted the game to be a lot more fair as a whole, I suppose. And then later on in 2007, the standardized point scoring was introduced. So instead of the judges just thinking about it like, oh, well, I think this guy won, they kind of shifted to how professional boxing had been doing it and started to count points. And so since we have some time, so I figured I'd talk a little bit about the history of professional boxing as well. And so in the beginning of the 20th century, professional boxing became one of the shortest ways to glory and wealth. Around this time, America became the center of the sport, primarily because of the economy at the time, as well as the amount of immigrants coming over, especially from places like Ireland. By 1915, the Irish became the dominating national group in professional boxing, with boxers such as Terry McGovern, Jack O'Brien, Mike Sullivan, Jack Dempsey, and many more, all dominating the sport. As it went on, the African American community began to really dominate the sport and gain prominence in the sport, due to the fact that many African Americans in the early 20th century were often living in poverty and grew up in very poor neighborhoods. And so the way a lot of people like to think about it is that, like, people like Mike Tyson have said this, people like Muhammad Ali have said this, that boxing a lot of times is just a way out. When you have really nothing else going for you in life, you can just put on some boxing gloves and train to become a boxer. So, and at the time, and still to this day, you could argue a lot of the poor community is African American. And so some examples of early African Americans gaining prominence in boxing would be Joe Walcott, George Dixon, Sam Langford, and many more. So, but at the time, obviously, times were very different back then. So, due to racism towards African American boxers at the time, boxing championships often became very hindered. Like, some boxers would refuse to defend their titles against African Americans. Thankfully, by the time the Great Depression had rolled around, this persecution of black boxers mostly had stopped, and racism had been pretty much out of the sport. So, and a very early example of this would be Joe Louis, who many consider to be one of the greatest boxers of all time. In 1937, Joe Louis became the world heavyweight champion and held the title up until retiring in 1949. So, you know, during his reign as champion, he fought in World War II, which is just a very interesting fact if you ask me. And after retirement, he came out of retirement to fight another boxing great, Rocky Marciano, in 1951. This fight he lost, and Marciano went on to become one of the greatest boxers of all time as well. As the sport went on, obviously there were many more greats, and there's a long history of boxers in the sport at all weight classes, at every decade. You know, obviously in the 70s, a lot of people would argue was the best time to be a boxing fan. Clearly, you know, you had Muhammad Ali, you had people like Joe Frazier, you had people like George Foreman, and then in other weight classes you had people like Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, and Tommy Hearns, and as it went on, it just more and more greats came and went. In the 80s and 90s, you had people like Mike Tyson, people like Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield, and even now you have people like Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, AJ Joshua, and so, you know, boxing continues to thrive to this day. So anyways, thank you for watching my video, and goodbye.